Hello, and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Dr Imran Ahmed, a visiting research fellow at the Institute. Today we'll be speaking about Afghanistan. 15th of August this year marks 1 year since the Taliban takeover of Kabul. The Taliban's quick success in toppling the US-backed government of Ashraf Ghani was surprising for many, including the Taliban themselves, and signaled the many failures of the US-led occupation of Afghanistan and its botched withdrawal. Images of desperation at airports as Taliban rule became a reality continue to haunt memories to the present day. There were uncertainties about how a Taliban government would govern, given its time in the shadows as an insurgent fighting force over the previous decades. There were also uncertainties about regional security and whether the Islamic Emirate would become a sanctuary for militant groups and pose a threat to neighbouring states and Western powers. The ethics and logistics of administering international aid and working with the Taliban continue to remain a contested matter. No country has accorded the Islamic Emirate formal recognition, and the debate on how or whether the Taliban can be brought to heel remains open. Here to help us take stock of the past 12 months and think about what might lie ahead for Afghanistan is Associate Professor Avinash Paliwal. Dr. Paliwal, welcome to South Asia Chat.
Thank you for having me here, Imran. It's an honor to be here for the podcast.
It's our pleasure. As an astute observer of Afghanistan, how has Afghanistan changed since the Islamic Emirate assumed power a year ago?
There are multiple fault lines that existed in Afghanistan, right? Right from the ethnic fault lines to sectarian fault lines to gender fault lines. Almost each of this fault line today, over the past 1 year or so since Kabul fell to the Taliban, they have become exacerbated, become much more violent in some ways or the other. So I would say instead of a huge change in itself, it's the continuity or the worsening of societal ties, which is one of the foremost marker of this regime, and it's 1 year worth of governance, if one can call that, since August 15, 2021. We can see that questions of representation within the Taliban continue to haunt both internal power brokers in Afghanistan as well as their international governmental interlocutors and non-governmental observers. How does the interim government, as it has been called till now, actually distributes power, keeping the ethnic and other sort of societal categories and the representation issues around that? How does that really kind of play out in governance structures of the Taliban is still a contested issue, right? It has led to this mantra or the demand for inclusivity, which means different things to different people as far as the Taliban is concerned. But no one actually knows what that actually means in practice, including the Taliban, which is struggling to figure out whether, just having kind of people of different ethnic groups be in the interim government, would that be sufficient, or it's something else that they can do or are willing to do at all that would help assuage some of those concerns, both domestically and internationally. So that I would say that is the most prominent feature to my mind that holds true for Afghanistan in 2022 is that almost every societal fault line has become more violent and more extreme than it was before. And the situation before the rise of the Taliban was no better in some ways.
Thank you very much for that sobering picture. I wanted to move to something that was a little bit more recent. What does the presence and recent death of Ayman al-Zawahiri, killed by a US drone strike, tell us about the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and perhaps other terror outfits residing in Afghanistan?
That's an excellent question. I think this drone strike in the heart of Kabul, literally a stone's throw away from the presidential palace in Sherpur in Kabul, it's quite indicative of certain things, certain multiple aspects, which some of which were known and others which were less kind of understood. First of all, the relationship between Al Qaeda and the Taliban never truly ceased in practice, right? There was a lot of negotiations by the Taliban around the promise and the premise that this kind of relationship that it enjoyed with the Taliban in the 90s will not exist again. But the fine print of these negotiations, as kind of seen in the open kind of aspects or parts of the Doha Agreement, but there are secret annexes too to that agreement. The devil lies in the detail, in the fine print, that they never promised that the Al Qaeda will not be present on the ground. The promise was that it will not plan anything or execute anything outside the territorial boundaries of Afghanistan, even if they're there on the ground in Afghanistan. So that's the promise. That's how Taliban looks at the Doha Agreement, unlike what the US or other international actors might want to see, that this is Taliban promising to cut the cord. No, if anything, that Al Qaeda was quite operational during its time, in Afghanistan, and it became increasingly operational over the last 1 year. We saw many more detailed reports, propaganda items coming out of the Taliban kind of that sector, and you can see Ayman al-Zawahiri himself making a lot of videos and propaganda for multiple purposes, right? Spreading the message, but also increasing the recruitment base of the organization, which has seen a lot of turmoil for internal and external reasons. So no, the relationship existed, the relationship thrived, despite the 20-year war that the Americans and all the NATO allies fought in Afghanistan. So that is truly a political failure of this entire war that was fought. But at the same time, the fact that he was killed by an American drone in Afghanistan, despite the fact that Americans have left the battlefield in a physical sense, shows an evolution of sorts in regional dynamics around Afghanistan. It shows that the Americans are still a very important actor as far as Afghanistan is concerned, both in a domestic and a regional sense. But also they have the capability to target someone inside the country despite not having boots on the ground. This simply implies that there is some degree of regional cooperation happening with the Americans, which the detail or the fine print of which is not out in the open. We still do not know where the drone actually took off from. And there's a huge speculation that the likelihood of that happening from Pakistani territory remains high, even if it's not corroborated. And the other bet is that it came somewhere from the Gulf. That, regardless of where it did come from, it's indicative of a fact that both regional players, Afghanistan's neighbors, and the Americans and the West at large, continues to keep an eye out on the situation on the ground, if not in a way that it did earlier, but certainly so as far as their direct national interests getting threatened is concerned in future. The third issue that I think this whole strike raises is, what does it mean for all the other transnational kind of Islamist groups that still operate, and we know that they operate from Afghan soil. It's not just the Al-Qaeda. If you ask an Indian policymaker, they would list Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed and their presence in Afghanistan. They would say that, okay, there are limited but certain number of Indians being recruited by the Islamic State of Khorasan province, and they have been found actively being trained or active on the battlefield in Afghanistan. So what is the Taliban? What does the Taliban has to offer other countries? And what their demands are. The Chinese have been asking for action on the ETIM. Pakistan, there is a whole new phase of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan insurgency that is playing out in real time inside Pakistan, and we know that literally the negotiations between the Pakistani security establishment on the kinetics of it, on the operations or the political demands being made by the TTP, are happening in Kabul with the Taliban itself. So this is a multi-dimensional story where the Taliban has not cut its cord with most transnational jihadis, and is perhaps kind of making promises that it will keep them under control if and when they get some degree of support, whether diplomatic or financial, from whichever interlocutor they're trying to engage with. And I think this is a process that we still need to see how it plays out, and it goes into the reluctance of a lot of countries to actually, in fact, most countries, to confer diplomatic recognition to the Taliban, which is very essential for them if you think about it from their domestic governance and economic issues, as far as those issues are concerned.
Thank you. Thank you so much for unpacking such a complex and evolving picture. Looking to the east now, the 15th of August also marks the 75th anniversary of Indian independence, and Indian ties with Afghanistan appear to be growing. Why did India reopen its embassy in Kabul, and what are the areas of New Delhi's mutual interest with working with the Taliban?
The primary reason, Imran, for opening India's embassy and they call it a technical mission, but the number of staff is anywhere between 60 to 70 people. So that's not an inconsequential amount, even though this would include quite a substantial set of security and support staff for the actual political officers and intelligence officers on the ground. First of all, India really lost out last year when the Taliban came to power. It was a shock for India to having to leave a country in which it had invested so much capital over the last 2 decades, and having had the horrible memory of being absent from that country, and then being caught in a very very embarrassing position during the 1999 IC-814, the Indian Airlines hijacking incident, when a civilian Indian airliner was hijacked on its way from Kathmandu to Delhi, and then flown through a circuitous route all the way into Kandahar, which was then controlled by the Taliban, and then having to kind of basically give up on some of this very prized kind of militants which India had arrested in relation to Kashmir. This is a memory that continues to haunt India, that we were not there, and that is when our vulnerabilities in Afghanistan were exploited by our strategic adversary, Pakistan, right? That's how Indian officials see the situation. So to this time, over the past 1 year, there was very clearly a consensus that India will not be absent from Afghanistan anymore, regardless of who is in power. And the fact that it had to leave the embassy compound, in a rush to save the lives of its officials itself was a shock big enough for them to kind of, deal with. So the calculus is very clear. Afghanistan is strategically critical. You cannot choose your neighbors. You cannot actually influence the rise of all of the Taliban in a strategic or a fundamental sense, let's say the way the Americans could in 2001 and 2. But you continue to deal with them. You continue to shape their behavior. And at the end of the day, you continue to see how Taliban's relationship with Pakistan is evolving and what space it offers you. That's the first geopolitical kind of realpolitik reason which has driven the policy making as far as India is concerned in terms of its outreach to the Taliban, right? The other reason, of course, is the idea of having a broader outreach to the people of Afghanistan, where India enjoys quite a considerable degree of warmth, if you say, a kind of historical, social kind of the relationship, the idea of India, regardless of what the internal politics of India is. The idea of India in Afghanistan has been a warm one, a positive idea, a positive image, and that is something that Indians don't want to lose anymore. They don't want to be seen as a neighbor that ran away when the people of Afghanistan needed it to be there. So that is why the outreach has happened, but it's also quite a restricted, limited outreach as far as the formal official charter is concerned. It allows India to offer humanitarian aid. It allows India to perhaps have conversation on its developmental projects, but no more.
Now, looking around the world, No country to date has recognized the Taliban, but the number of diplomatic missions on the ground appears to be increasing. India, for instance, became the 15th mission to open in Kabul, a decision lauded by the Taliban leadership. What does it tell us about the international mood towards the Taliban? Are there indications that the Taliban are more amenable to international pressure, or is the international community losing its leverage over the group?
I think there is. I'll answer that question using a recent example, the debate that is playing out on whether or not to extend the travel ban on the Taliban or the Taliban senior figures who have been traveling,
Yes.
traveling across the world, and there are increased calls to actually put the travel ban or make the travel ban more onerous and less liberal, or the travel allowance less liberal. And this is something which shows that the international, I mean, whether it's the Americans, whether it's other powers, they've struggled to exercise the leverage that they do enjoy with the Taliban, right? It's not as if the international powers or the great powers don't have leverage over the Taliban. The 7 billion worth of aid that the Americans are supposed to at least half of which they're supposed to disburse or to give to the Taliban, 3.5 billion, if not to the Taliban, sorry, to the people of Afghanistan. That is something that has offered a very substantial stake to the Americans to deal with the Taliban and shape their behavior. The Indians or other partners, right, other neighboring actors have used the as they say, the promise of humanitarian aid or more financial aid to the Taliban, which is seriously cash-strapped and is struggling to govern its economy and to bring it back in shape. That is a huge that's a huge tool of leverage, but they have also struggled to actually exercise it. They have not been able to make the Taliban relent on social issues like girls' education, or to behave, or to just not undertake witch hunting within the system against the former Republican, Islamic Republican kind of officials who still continue to remain there. And I'm not talking about the Karzais and the Abdullahs who are there in Kabul, but the other junior, second tier and third tier officials who have been hounded, some of who have been killed as well. So that is a serious hindrance that the international community is facing. They've just not been able to tell the Taliban. They've been able to tell the Taliban what to do, but not been able to get them to deliver. So I think that is a struggle that shall continue. I think in the foreseeable future, and there is a reason for that. I think it's not really about what the US or what India or the West or what the other neighbors of Afghanistan want from it, but it's more about the domestic politics of the Taliban, the intra-Taliban politics itself. There are huge. I mean, it's a movement which is deeply split. It was a movement that was an insurgent movement for a long time, suddenly came into power. It didn't expect to come into power the way it did, even if it did expect to come to power at some point in time. But the suddenness of it last year took even the Talibs by surprise to a considerable degree. And right now we see two broad factions, right? One is the Kandahar group, so-called Kandahar group, with Mullah Baradar
Yes.
and Mullah Yaqub kind of dominating the scene. And then is the Haqqani family, which basically have much more firepower and are in control of Kabul and adjoining areas, right? That's a serious split. And it's easy to kind of underestimate the impact that kind of split has on these issues related to governance, on which the international community is making demands. It is the Kandahar Shura which actually supported this deeply domestically unpopular decision of not reopening girls' school. Yes, there is an ideological push for that to happen, but there is also a political rationale. It complicates the Haqqani family's international outreach. This whole idea of the Haqqanis trying, Sirajuddin Haqqani or Anas Haqqani, being the pragmatic sort of figures within the Taliban, trying to reopen schools and make Afghanistan, quote unquote, a normal country. That is something that becomes deep, that frustrates that outreach, that narrative, as far as the external interlocutors are concerned. The fact that Eman al-Zawahiri was found in Kabul, which is under control of Sirajuddin Haqqani, and just hours after that drone strike, and this is before the whole thing becomes open knowledge to everyone, and it kind of makes news flash across the world. It was Mullah Yaqub who was giving a long interview with the NPR, the U.S. Radio, NPR, yeah, the National Public Radio of the United States. And there are still questions about the timing of that interview, the purpose of that interview. It's quite unusual for Yaqub to come to come and give interviews both to TV channels and radio stations of this kind of such international audiences. It's I think a lot of the problems have to do in many ways to the intra-Taliban politics that is playing out in a very violent competitive sense. Rather than what leverage the international community has or not. And I think that's worth keeping an eye out moving forward, because which faction comes to dominate in a long-term sense will have a huge impact on what Afghanistan or the Emirat or whatever form of governance it adopts eventually in a formal sense actually looks like.
Thank you very much for that. My final question relates to the domestic resistance the Taliban are facing. Recently, we've had reports of the Islamic State-led killing of Rahimullah Haqqani, a prominent Taliban religious leader, in a suicide bombing, something the Taliban have also confirmed. Now, what is driving the Islamic State's battle against the Taliban, and what do we know about IS's motives, ideology, composition, and strategy? Can the Islamic Emirate co-opt or coexist with the Caliphate, or are the two fundamentally incompatible? I've squeezed in a few questions into one there.
No, thank you for that range of questions. ISKP is a okay. Let me just take a step back and kind of give my first sort of view of ISKP broadly put. Right, I think this movement is a bit of a piece of abstract art. One makes of it what one makes of it, and it has different sort of the origins are complicated, the motives perhaps they seem very clear and they seem very black and white, but I'm not sure about that. Right? They do want to capture the Afghan state. There is no two ways about it. This is a movement which is ideologically driven by an extreme version of kind of political Islam, and they don't bother. And this is, I think, is a fundamental difference. They don't bother with even a patina of popular appeal among the people of Afghanistan or elsewhere or wherever they are controlling, whichever state they are controlling. Because they see the rule as a very top-down rule. So this social contract that we see in most other societies and states and nation states, where there is a contract between the state and the citizen, however skewed or complicated or corrupted that might be, they don't bother with that. That's not a contract, or at least that's a contract that's a completely one-sided contract as far as the ISKP is concerned. And we have seen that kind of in the case of Syria and Iraq, when the Islamic State did exist in the shape and form it did in the last decade. So that is something that is incompatible with the Taliban. The Taliban is also an Islamist movement. I don't put much cachet on the Pashtun nationalism aspect of it, even though it is infused into certain streams of the Taliban's day-to-day routine governance. It's an Islamist outfit, but it still has some degree of respect for at least some sort of a popular appeal or keeping people on side, right? And that is why you see the factional fights that are happening. Those factional fights between the Kandaharis and the Haqqanis won't happen without some degree of popular support in some sections of Afghan society across ethnicities, right? That is not what the Islamic State of Khorasan province really bothers with. It operates in cells, it operates clandestinely, it strikes at its own choosing. And yes, it has been targeted against and its capabilities have been degraded, but it exists. So I don't see an ideological compact emerging between the Caliphate and the Emirates for that very reason, because this is, if I take the example of the left movements in different parts of the subcontinent, it's like the Marxists and the Naxalites. They just will never coexist with each other in India, right? This is, in fact, if you ask a Marxist in India, they would say the first and foremost challenge they face or have faced in the past is from the Naxals, less from the parliamentary democracy or the other kind of, systems and the political parties or the government security agencies they had to battle during the heyday of their movement in India from. So you can see that kind of very serious ideological struggle panning out and Taliban continuing to remain the dominant force therein. In terms of the ISKP's motivations, and coming back to this issue apart from the fact that it plans for state capture, there has been an interesting, the timing of their attacks, the target of their attacks have been very interesting. I think the killing of Haqqani is a case where which almost makes it seem like the ISKP is much more invested in targeting the Haqqanis rather than anyone else. And I think they view Haqqanis as a much more potent threat to their own existence than they see other factions, including the Kandaharis. Even though, I mean, these are really kind of tenuous distinctions. They have targeted Taliban of every sort and kind, but I think the high-profile attacks that the Haqqanis have dealt with is something which is worth keeping an eye out on. And the other example I want to offer is the attack at the Kabul airport when the evacuations were going on last year, when the Americans were leaving, right? There were a couple of blasts that really took a heavy toll. So it's something that, you can see that this is a highly disruptive force. And that disruptiveness goes against it may or may not allow it to actually take on state power, but it does complicate the Taliban's life. It does kind of make Taliban run administration much more difficult, given how much resources it will have to focus on the ISKP. In terms of the composition, again, Imran, I'll stop after that.
Sure.
It's very interesting because historically this is a movement that that attracted individuals from across ethnic and sectarian lines. Well, not sectarian, at least ethnic lines. There were people from Uzbekistan, there were people from Pakistan, there were Afghans of different ethnicity who joined the ISKP either out of being disgruntled with the Talibs or other movements that they were part of, or being too ambitious. Or both at the same time, right? Today we see, there is a huge sort of Afghan and Pakistani presence in the composition of the ISKP, but there are even former Islamic Republican figures from the former Afghan army, who are willing to join the ISKP. Now that is a worrying trend for them because these figures see that ISKP is the only movement which can offer them secrecy, which they desire, to not get caught by the Taliban and be killed out of vengeance, and also offer them a way to actually target the Taliban, whom they see responsible for their own collapse. And that is something which will be very interesting to watch in the months and years to come. How is it that the Islamic Republic or sections of the Islamic Republic morphed and joined the ISKP's ranks to target or to resist the Taliban, instead of joining the groups like the National Resistance Front in the north, which is primarily a Tajik Panjshiri entity, if not entirely so, but dominantly so. It has the echoes of the de-Baathification of Iraq and the Iraqi state apparatus from Saddam Hussein's time, kind of joining the extreme right, and the former generals during Saddam's time actually fighting the battles for the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. There are some degree of there's some reflections of that in Afghanistan, even if the scale is not the same.
Professor Paliwal, you've given us so much to consider. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Imran.
You're listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter.